All right. Good evening, everybody. Hello. Welcome to Politics and Prose Bookstore. My name is Keith. I'm a bookseller here. I just want to go through a few housekeeping details before we get started. If you could just take a minute to silence your cell phones. And when we get to the time for opening the floor for questions, if you could step up to our standing mic here right by the pillar so that everyone can hear your question. And we want the question to be heard in our audio recording of the event. Tonight's event is live streamed. It's going to be up on our Politics and Prose YouTube channel. Following the Q&A, we'll have a signing line right here at this table. If you haven't already purchased the book, we have many copies behind the registers up at the front of the store. And then we'll have everyone line up again by this pillar here. And then finally, after the event is over, if you could just take a moment to fold up your chairs and lean them against something sturdy to help our events team. So now, without further ado, I'm very excited to welcome Shane McCrae, celebrating the release of Pulling the Chariot of the Sun, a memoir of a kidnapping. Shane McCrae is the author of several books of poetry, including In the Language of My Captor, which was a finalist for the National Book Award, the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, and the William Carlos Williams Award. Sometimes I Never Suffered, shortlisted for the T.S. Eliot Prize, and his most recent collection, Cain Named the Animals. McCrae is the recipient of a Whiting Award, a National Endowment for the Arts Literature Fellowship, a Lannan Literary Award, and a Guggenheim Fellowship. He teaches at Columbia University and lives in New York City. Shane McCrae will be in conversation with Kyle Dargan, the author of many books of poetry and the winner of the 2019 Lenore Marshall Poetry Prize and longlisted for the 2019 Pulitzer Prize for Poetry. Kyle Dargan is currently an associate professor of literature and assistant creative director of creative writing at American University. He also works as the books editor for Janelle Monáe's creative company, Wonderland. So please join me in welcoming Shane and Kyle to Politics and Prose.
Hi, folks. So I'm just going to start by reading some bits, and then we're going to talk about things. It's probably going to take about like 6 or 7 minutes. I think the goal was 5 minutes, but I couldn't do it. So this is from near the beginning of the book. When I'm 3 years old, my grandparents kidnapped me. For most of my life, I've not known what to call what they did. Growing up, I never thought to call it kidnapping. And my mother, whenever she explained to me why I was living with my grandparents and not with her, which she did almost every time I saw her, explained with the gentlest words possible, but also quietly, her voice at the edge of a whisper, so that what they did seemed like a normal thing, but also something I should never talk about to anybody. My grandfather had always wanted a son, and although he had physically abused my mother when she was a child, even though he was abusing her still, psychologically, when he told her he wanted to raise me, she believed that because I was a boy, he would treat me differently. And so, when I'm 3 years old, my grandparents convinced my mother that I would be better off living with them, and don't worry, she can visit me anytime she wants. And then my grandparents convinced my father to let them take me with them on a weekend trip to a nearby lake. I think it was a nearby lake. Wherever it was they said they were taking me couldn't have been far away, and the only trips I remember taking with my grandparents ended at lakes, or at least briefly featured lakes in the middle, after which my father intends to take me to Phoenix, Arizona, to spend a few days with relatives whose names I don't now know. Why do I find the thought that I might have met them years later and not known they were the people I was supposed to have met when I was 3, in the days that were instead the first days after I was kidnapped, unsettling? Though my father might have mentioned them in the days before my grandparents kidnapped me, my family, though he might have said their names out loud. Then my grandparents take me from Salem, Oregon to Round Rock, Texas, without telling my father. He arrives at their house in Salem on Monday morning to discover the house has been stripped bare. Even the curtains are gone. They tell my mother she will never see me again if she tells my father where I am. They will take me to Mexico and disappear forever. From the kidnapping on, nobody mentions my father to me except to tell me he didn't want me. But that's okay because he's black, and I shouldn't want him right back. I grow up screaming, I don't want him right back. A scream will travel as far as people choose to hear it, as far as people along the way it travels choose to hear it. sometimes across a country, sometimes not as far as the lips through which it passes. A scream can be its own ghost, unwilled. Decades after my grandparents kidnapped me, decades after I found him, my father told me the story of my kidnapping. Not immediately, not the first time I saw him after finding him, not the next time I saw him after finding him, not while I lived with my grandmother still, then not while my grandmother was still alive, then not while I might be mourning her still. Not the story of the kidnapping itself. A kidnapping can be a hole in the middle of the story of itself, so often is a hole, rather than strangers pulling up next to a child in a parking lot, the door of a van sliding open. Not the story of the parts he didn't see. My grandmother dressing me for the trip, my grandmother holding my hand as she walked me from the front door to the car. Not the drive to the airport, not the flight, the plane seeming to ascend too steeply, then slipping backward for a moment just after takeoff. My grandmother thinking she was going to die, me laughing, ecstatic, an event she talked about many times when I was a child without, of course not, once mentioning she was kidnapping me when it happened. My father told me the story of my kidnapping as he experienced it, rushing to my grandparents' house after he couldn't reach them on the phone the morning they were supposed to have brought me back to him. Even from the street, the house looked empty. He could see the house was empty through the windows from the street. Still, he crossed the front yard and pressed his forehead against a window and stared into the house, making a tunnel with his hands, one on either side of his face, so he could more clearly see the enormous nothingness pouring from the house. Decades later, in the midst of a stretch of months during which white Americans publicly acknowledged the mistreatment of black Americans by police, my father explained why he hadn't asked the police for help finding me, which was for the same reason he couldn't ask the police for help with anything else. A story will travel as far as people want to hear it. And the next part, which is pretty short, is called The Wish. When I say it in my head, it sounds obvious, but still, it strikes me as something I must write down. I don't remember when I started blocking painful memories and memories of things I couldn't understand. Painful memories, memories of things I couldn't understand, and memories of events, of people I couldn't integrate into my idea of who I was. Which idea, of course, I was both defacing and creating whenever I blocked memories. But I must have been young. For years, decades, I've assumed I must have started blocking memories when my grandfather started beating me, or maybe soon after. Maybe with the third or fourth beating, or however many beatings it takes to convince a boy, a toddler or just after, that the only way for him to defend himself is to attack his own mind. Just now, as I was thinking about the events leading up to my kidnapping, the lies my grandmother, her alone, must have told my father, since my grandfather, who, when he discovered my mother was pregnant and discovered the father was black, grabbed a hunting rifle from the wall and had to be wrestled to the ground by his older brother, wouldn't have spoken to my father, since my grandfather was the sort of man who might kill a person to whom he nonetheless wouldn't speak. Just now I realized I just as likely, maybe more likely, started blocking memories in the weeks following my kidnapping, and at least partly as a result of my kidnapping. And I want to say entirely as a result of my kidnapping, though I'm sure that isn't true. I want to say I started forgetting my life only because I had been taken away, physically removed from my life. I want to say nobody could have hit me hard enough to make me forget my life with my father, though my grandfather started beating me in the weeks following my kidnapping, in the days following my kidnapping. But it would be just as true to say my grandfather couldn't hit me hard enough to stop me from eventually calling him Dad. A father is more a wish than a man. Thank you.
Mic'd up, ready to go. Welcome to DC.
Thank you.
What stop on the tour is this? So,
Well, I mean, I guess it's a tour. That's what they're calling it. I guess this is the second one.
okay, cool. I guess before we get started, I just wondered how many people in the audience feel they have a memory or an experience from their past that they feel they're sort of constantly repiecing together over time. You could just raise a hand. See. Yeah. So, okay, for all of you, I think this is definitely a book that's up your alley. So I was halfway through the book, and I don't think I've ever really read an account of kidnapping before. So that was new to me. And as I was reading it, also knowing that, you also write poetry, I started thinking to myself, kidnapping is kind of like a form of erasure. And for those of you not familiar with erasure as a poetic form, that's when you sort of take a text and redact parts to make a new text, right? And I think there's this line in the book that I am not the story I've been told, sort of something along those lines. And I was like, because that story you've been told is the product of the erasure. And then I get to that passage on 147, where I think basically like you just kind of lay that out. And I was like, so I was on track. So I guess I'm just wondering, and you don't have to read that passage if you don't want to, or you could just say, Mark, I just wonder if you could just say a bit more about, I guess, that relationship between kidnapping and erasure.
Well, let me. We talked about this a little bit. I know. I don't mind reading it. Let me take a look at it so I can see exactly what part you're talking about. I know the whole thing is kind of about that, but let me see. Actually, yeah, coming from the world of poetry, these sorts of things you just sort of read a lot, and then nobody asks you questions. And my understanding is that for nonfiction it's the opposite. But I'll read this too. I hope that's okay. I'll just read the whole thing. It's not very long. Most of a kidnapping, almost all of it, happens after the child is taken. If the child is taken young enough, and by a person are persons who intend to raise the child as if the child were their own, then for months after the child is taken, with both great caution and great intensity, and then more casually for years after the first months after the child is taken, the kidnappers must work to erase the memory of the child's previous caretaker or caretakers. If there is some continuity between the child's previous situation and the child's situation after the kidnapping, if, say, one of the child's two previous caretakers continues to visit the child after the kidnapping, and assuming the caretaker who is now collaborating with the child's kidnappers is at least careful not to speak too often and too positively about the child's other previous caretaker, especially in the months immediately following the kidnapping, then the kidnappers will likely have an easier time erasing the memory of the child's previous situation than they would have if there were no continuity between the child's two situations. If one of a child's two previous caretakers continues to visit the child after the kidnapping, the child's mother, say, and let's say the other caretaker had been the child's father, from whom the child was kidnapped. Let's say the child's mother had been a teenager and a high school dropout when the child was born, and was at the time of the kidnapping only 21, though she might have been 22. Let's say you've just realized you don't know the time of year the child was kidnapped. Was he taken as leaves fell, or were the trees dead and bare? Or was he taken as life returned to the trees? Or, when the child was taken, had life returned so thoroughly, who could think it had ever left, though the sun burned bright and hot, and the thick leaves of the tree, when you brushed them aside to get a better look at the crying toddler in the arms of the white woman, the leaves felt too hot to be alive, though fire leaps like a living thing. Let's say the kidnappers were the parents of the mother, and though she no longer lived with them, she still thought of herself as their child before she thought of herself as an independent adult. Then the child's kidnappers will find themselves well positioned to concoct a story according to which the caretaker from whom the child was kidnapped had not been present in the child's life before the kidnapping, which in the story was not a kidnapping, but a favor the grandparents did for their daughter, and had in fact villainously abandoned not only the child but also the mother, just as the child was about to be born. This story takes years to tell. This story must replace not only the child's life, let's say the child is a boy, before the kidnapping, but his life after the kidnapping. For the safety of everyone involved in the kidnapping, least of all the boy's safety, he must never stop telling the story. The long work of the kidnapping is turning the boy into a machine for protecting his kidnappers. The final test of the kidnapping success is whether he protects them after he leaves them. And the thing about it is, the way that this sort of worked in my life, so I had written about being kidnapped, I think for years before this, in one way or another, because I was in some sense aware of it, but it wasn't until maybe a year or so ago, when I was in the midst of writing the book, that I'd already started writing upon, about what it's about. It was after listening to my dad on the radio talking about it. that it occurred to me, oh, hey, you know what? I was kidnapped. And I knew it, but in some ways I didn't know it. And ever since then, it's just been awful to deal with. But for most of my life, when I was sort of telling the story and not telling the story and not really realizing it, I didn't really feel it at all. I was just aware of it. And I think that that's a consequence of this idea of sort of erasing the self of the child in order to make the child sort of play along with the kidnapping.
Yeah, because at first it seems like, what your grandparents were telling you was sort of, I guess, framed as like a revision, but really it was much more violent than a revision, right? That it was that actual erasure. A stylistic thing that I was curious about, and I want to try to not go back and forth between poetry and memoir too much, because I feel like that happens, when poets sort of move out of the genre. But one of the things about, say, a book of poems, right, is that there really isn't a sort of set understanding of what every book of poems does. Like when you show up to a book of poems, you kind of have to figure out what that book of poems is trying to do, right? As opposed to, say, a memoir, a novel, there are certain expectations that go with how those types of books move, right?
Sure.
And I was reading this memoir, though, I was kind of getting that feeling of reading a book of poems in the sense, like, I think I have to learn how this book is trying to tell this story. Like,
Sure.
I understand what the title of memoir is doing, but there's more work to sort of understand. And I think one of those things that I saw happening again and again in the book is the way you used reiteration, right? There are things that are sort of reiterated within the chapters and things that are reiterated across the book. I'm wondering, like, how you settled upon that and sort of, like, how necessary of a tool was that to you to write the book?
Sure. Well, first, thank you from the bottom of my heart and for the rest of my life for asking me about this aspect of it. Because I think that I've been sort of confronting with regard to nonfiction is I think what people want is the story. They want information, which I understand, but being somebody who tries to write poetry, I'm interested in technique. What I want is to work with words, and I want to make words in some sense appealing, even if they're talking about horrible things. And so it has been, when I've been thinking about the memoir and thinking about how to present it to people, I want to say, this is, in some ways, at least with regard to making it, an expression of a really long relationship I've had with, like, Samuel Beckett and Virginia Woolf and just experimental writing in general. But what everybody really wants is, so talk about the kidnapping, which it does. I mean, it talks about that stuff. But I settled upon it because, I was fairly certain that I was never going to write another book of prose again, as I had been fairly certain that I would never write a book of prose ever to begin with. Not even, like, poets, they, like, eventually they're like, they've got, like, they haven't done enough, piecemeal reviews to put together a little collection of essays. I thought I would never do that. I thought, I'm not going to write enough prose to get a collection of essays, because prose, it's so hard to do, and it takes so long because it's so full of words. And I just thought, I can't write that many words. But because this was going to be my one shot at doing it, I thought, well, there's so many different things I want to do technically. There's so many writers that I've been interested in that are very particular stylists. And, I suppose I could just write a story or, recount the history of the thing in a really kind of straightforward way. But being a poet, you know how this is. If you are trying to tell a story economically in prose, you will tell the whole thing in like a paragraph, because that's what we do, is we compress. And so if I'm going to actually enjoy writing the thing, make it as good as I can make it, then I can't just tell the story in a really straightforward, plain way. I have to work through technique. And the other thing is that I'm sort of trying, in the way the book is written, to sort of create in the reader, or reproduce in the reader, or at least suggest in the reader, the feeling of what it's like to not really remember oneself, and to sort of be constantly reconstructing, who one is. And so it is a book that reiterates things a lot. It is a book that's talks about different things, or talks about the same thing over and over again, because it's trying to build a person. So I think I was trying to do a couple things with that.
Yeah, and when I got to the end, of course, I saw the subtitle, first, and like you said, I was like, ooh, like a kidnapping story, which you do get. But once I went through, I was like, man, like it is a kidnapping story, but I also feel like it's a book about the nature of memory.
Yeah, it really is.
Like,
yeah, I was. I don't know anything about memoirs. I've read some, but I think about, the word memory when I think about memoir. And so, and I thought, I'm in some ways well positioned to write one insofar as my memory is just a mess. It hardly works. It is barely functional. And it gets worse as I get older. The thing that I've learned is that although when I was young, I was blocking memories just to sort of survive, I think either because I started doing it so young or because the work that I had to do was so aggressive. In the passage I read, I talked about how I didn't know what time of year I was kidnapped, but then there was a profile about this whole thing in the New York Times like a week ago, and I learned from reading that profile when I was kidnapped. It was June, so I was actually almost 4 years old because my birthday's in September. And I had to just sort of tear apart my entire childhood up to 4 in order to live with my grandparents, in order to sort of buy their story. Part of their story was that I was 18 months when they took me, which is completely not true. And so I had to kind of attack myself, attack my mind, my sense of my own identity. And I got into that habit so young and kind of didn't realize I was doing it, that I have no mechanism for stopping it. And so I just hardly ever hold on to things. It is no fun. Things that are really, really important to me, that are positive things, generally speaking, I can remember, but a lot of things I really can't. And I wanted the memoir to, in the way that it's written, reflect that.
Yeah, I think one of the things that really captured that for me was the contrast between what you do give in such rich detail, and then the parts of the book where you're like, yeah, that's like 4 years. I just don't have anything.
Yeah, yeah.
Like, what happened there?
That's. Oh, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt.
And no. It's because there was like certain things where I was like I'm reading all the skateboarding detail, and I'm like, should I go to Google and like do some background? Like, is the skate like is that? But then it's like, well, no, that's what the speaker could kind of pull together easily.
Yeah.
But there's also something being said in the fact that there are these significant passages where the reader's like, I don't have access.
Yeah.
Or it's just not there.
You really read this book. I really appreciate it. That matters to me so much because what you're talking about. So I have made the mistake of going to Goodreads more than once to look at their reviews. I really shouldn't do that.
Never go to Goodreads.
No, never go to Goodreads. But like, there's this one long review. Some of them are just offensive, but there's one of them that's like, I wish I could. It's always very sensitive people. And one of them is like, I wish I could just hold Shane and tell him, it's not important whether you turned left or turned right on this day. What's important is the heart of the story or whatever. I'm like, man, you do not know what it's like to not remember anything. When I can remember that I turned left, I am writing that down because it's so exciting to have any memory of anything. And so there are some passages that are very rich in detail. I want to really, or I can't talk about my own writing as rich. There's a lot of details. There's a lot of details because it's so exciting to remember it. Like, it's such a thrill to be able to describe, a particular skateboard trick because I know how all the parts work. And I wanted, the reader who didn't ride a skateboard to still be able to kind of picture what was happening. But yeah, it means the world to me that I can remember if I went left or right on a particular day, and I'm gonna write that down. It's the state of my memory when I wrote the book. But yeah, there are plenty of things I don't remember at all. And near the ending, without giving it away, what ends up happening, as I think you're kind of alluding to, is in order to tell the story of finding my father, I just have to kind of give in to not remembering things and go with what my memory is telling me. And what my memory is telling me is just impossible. But that's the only way to tell the story. And I just have to admit, okay, it couldn't have happened this way, but this is what I remember, and go with that.
Yeah. And I mean, I think there are clues sort of leading up to that. Like, there's the part where you talk about moving through San Francisco, sort of up to the other part of California. And you're talking about like the first day of school there, and it's like, well, that couldn't have been the first day of school there because that. So I think like, if you do, take the time and you sort of read the book slowly, and I think the fact that you do have these short chapters sort of encourages that, that you should, like, I don't think it's the kind of memoir that you blast through in the airport.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, you can, but then you might wind up writing one of these oversensitive Goodreads reviews. And so I guess maybe as a poet who is encouraged to read slow and kind of read at that atomic level, like maybe that's part of why. I'm wondering about the origins of the book, because that was like one of my big questions. Like, I know you kind of speak to it a little bit in the acknowledgments, but as I was going through, I was like, all right, like, did someone come to him and tell him, like, there's a story here, you should write this book? Or was he thinking in the back of his mind, I think there's a memoir here and I should try it? And I could imagine it. I was sort of gaming it out from both sides. And you say it's something that you had been thinking about.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, like, what was the thing that started the creative process towards actually iterating the book?
Well, so the way to answer that question is going to be kind of a loop. I think the thing that's the biggest impetus is my wife, Melissa, who kept telling me that I should, tell the story of my life, just because she felt like she was always kind of learning new things that were kind of surprising to her. And I think that was sort of the biggest engine, her interest. And there was a way in which I was writing it for her, that I wanted to please her. I wanted to produce a thing that she would want to read. But I was also in some ways thinking about it for a long time. So back when I was in graduate school, I went for poetry, but when you're, at least at the graduate school I went to, every year agents would come from New York City. I didn't go to graduate school in New York. Every year agents would come from New York City and come talk to the prose writers. And I wanted to, I don't know why, maybe just because I was jealous because I was a poet. I wanted to talk to the agents too. So this is 2003 or 2002. And I said, I've got a story. But I didn't really know what it was, which kind of doesn't make a lot of sense, I know. But it's partly because I hadn't really admitted this whole stuff to myself. I wasn't really dealing with it. But I had some sense that there was something I needed to talk about. And slowly, over like the next decade, I started to realize what I really needed to write about. And so maybe in 2014, I first sort of started to do it. It was still pretty unfocused then. It wasn't really until maybe 2019 or 2020, maybe, when I really got serious about it. And that was primarily, as I said, because of my wife's encouragement, partly because, I had been talking to an agent, and she was interested in me writing a memoir, and I started to think, well, what would that be about? Several outside factors, and also me thinking about it for like 20 years.
Man, what was I? I was just thinking about that. Oh yeah, so once you did start getting into the writing, you said it's like 2019. Was the fragmentation cooked in already?
Yeah.
Or was that sort of?
It was much less linear than it is now. Again, this was partly the encouragement, or largely the encouragement of my editor, that I made the sections make sense chronologically. My editor and my agent, I should say. My agent encouraged this, and then my editor sort of reinforced it. Because the parts, at least to begin with, before I kind of made the book proposal, were kind of not really in chronological order. They were more like in order of feeling, whatever that is. But then I thought, if it's a book of prose and it's already going to be written in this kind of dense way, it would make it a lot easier if I were to just kind of arrange things chronologically. So it was always going to be fragmentary, because that's just how my memory works anyway. But I have tried to arrange it in a way where it is, at least in a chronological sense, fairly easy to follow.
And we're coming up on the half-hour mark, and I know people had questions. Do we have a audience? There's the audience mic in case people have questions. Then you can start lining up. It was something, and I don't know if I have fully had my head around this yet, because I know it sort of starts with, this loss of the connection to your father, which you can argue is like the beginning of that erasure process. And then I noticed, like, throughout, there were these moments where an African American or a black figure would sort of like come in to sort of like the scene, and it was just kind of like this reaching for that, like, like there's something here that I recognize or want, but I don't quite know, sort of, and I'm wondering like if that's just something that I was picking up on, or is like there's actually something there, because I don't think the book ever like fully squares up with that. I mean, it does with like and how it relates to the father.
Yeah.
But then there's these sort of tertiary characters throughout.
I mean, I think that that's probably fairly unconscious, but I think it also reflects a sort of reality of my childhood. Being a black child and raised by white racists is complicated. And
It's not an uncommon experience.
yes, it isn't an uncommon experience. And I had a sense, if it makes sense, when I was a little kid, of being somehow both black and not black. And so I thought about black folks constantly. And I lived in a very, very white area. And so when in the book black characters kind of appear and just kind of vanish, like they're not there for long, that's partly because of that's where I lived and that's sort of what it was like where I lived. But I would always notice, and I think that there was some sort of calling back to memories that I either didn't have or didn't admit that I had of my father, and a sort of yearning towards something inchoate that I couldn't quite piece together.
Any questions? Yes, sir.
Good evening, and thanks to both of you for such a rich discussion, and especially to you for your personal sharing and coming to DC. As I get older, I get more interested in words, and so mine's going to be an observation rather than a question.
Okay.
I appreciate what you both were talking about, words and their significance in poetry. I appreciated what you were saying about how your past was kind of erased from you, and you knew what happened to you, but you didn't know it, and memory sort of eventually. So the word here tonight is kidnapping. And when you first said that word, I had this image of my mind about a boy sleeping, a kid napping. And yours is a story of awakening and coming out of that sleep into sort of the appreciation of what happened to you. So I offer that as sort of, is it a double entendre? Rather than being a verb or a gerund, kidnapping, you're now a man awake or a man informed and so forth. So I appreciate, I hope what I'm saying has some clarity, although I get nervous and ramble. So
No. Thank you for that. Yeah, no, that makes sense. I suppose I hadn't thought of it that way, but sure, yeah, that is in there.
I mean, I think it's another way of thinking about the memory issue, right? It's like when you come out of a dream, it's like, did that happen?
Yeah.
And I feel like there are lots of moments in the book where you're going back to your past, like, did that happen? Is it? I mean, I think for me, one of the moments that really stuck with me, like a figure, is the grandfather, and the way he's kind of described in this quasi monstrous way. And I'm not saying like you speak about him with vehemence. I was actually very surprised how little anger I felt in the prose towards the grandparents, actually, as I read the book. But the grandfather, the way you talk about his body, his behavior, and like, we don't immediately get glimpses into what's actually happening. Like sometimes it's alluded to, sometimes you get to it, directly, and like that figure is sort of like a dream monstrous figure. The way he grows and shrinks throughout the narrative was really interesting to me.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that this a feeling of kind of testing reality and did X or Y happen. I think that's a part of it, and partly it's because I can't remember things. Partly it's because I discovered I had, when I was in graduate school for the second time, some sort of weird sleep condition, which I didn't know I had. I was doing, I was a graduate student, and so I didn't have any money, and I was doing some sort of, I was going to do one of those, sleep study. Yeah. And so I was at I was being interviewed, an intake interview, and they said, so what's your sleep usually like? And I said, well, I close my eyes, and as soon as I close my eyes, I start dreaming, and then, I fall asleep. And they're like, wait, what? What'd you say? And I said, yeah, I close my eyes and I start dreaming. Because if I close my eyes for longer than a blink, I start dreaming right away. And I will be awake, but I'll be having a dream. And so I was informed that is actually not the common experience. I was like 30 when I learned that this is not what everybody does. And it makes the boundary between reality and unreality a little porous anyway, because I will be conscious, but having some really bizarre things going on, and being in that and also being aware of the outside world. And so I think a combination of having a really terrible memory and having this weird sleep dream thing going on, I think that those both sort of contribute to that aspect of the book.
Maybe like a word for that, like hypnagogia or something like that.
Maybe that's what that is.
Boundary between the French have a word for it.
Sure.
That's even better, that I've forgotten because that was high school French. Any other questions from the audience?
I love answering questions. It's really my art, honestly, is the Q&A. So you don't miss out. Is what I'm saying. Okay, great, perfect.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, I was wondering if you had any other work, either of your own that this is in conversation with, or more broadly, anything that you read, either in content or in style, that you see this in conversation with.
Well, I don't want to say this in a way that makes it sound like a plug. I've written a lot of books of poetry, and there are ways in which it is probably in conversation with all of them, either stylistically or content-wise. I have a book coming out, a poems coming out in October, and I have poems about the kidnapping in that. Books that it's in conversation with that I didn't write, probably some stuff, probably some Woolf, things by Woolf in particular. I guess maybe The Waves, and also just a lot of Beckett, maybe late Beckett, maybe. Yeah, I would say that those are two authors. I would say that, as I mentioned earlier, that I was probably trying to emulate consciously or unconsciously, and I would like to think it's in conversation with them, which is not to suggest that they would deign to talk back, but rather that I am at least yelling in their general direction.
I guess with that in mind, I know you talked about it in the book, encountering Plath in high school, and that sort of being the start of your relationship to poetry, and sort of taking her assessment of what is poetry, or at least effective poetry, and how that translated for you. I'm curious now, looking back on that, like how much has your perception of poetry changed since that moment?
An awful lot. What I appreciated in Plath was her real intense rage. I was really into that when I was a teenager, because I had, for reasons, some really intense rage that was in some ways kind of unfocused. And I saw something in the late poems of Plath that seemed like a channel for that. And so I just really liked her intensity. But I'm at, I'm almost 20 years older than she ever lived to be. And my conception of what poetry is not by any means more mature than hers, but it's just different now because more time has passed. And for me, intensity isn't the only thing anymore. There are other things in which I am more interested, and partly because I don't feel that way anymore. You said that you didn't detect a lot of anger toward my grandfather or my grandparents in general. There are ways in which I'm very angry, but I'm not. I just don't. You can't live with that forever, and so I just don't feel the same way now. And so I want to do other things with my poems, other than make. Like if you were really diligent, and I do not advise this, I can't imagine why anybody would want to, but I started publishing poems when I was like 18. And if you really wanted to know and knew what my old last name was, because I changed it to my father's last name, you could find my poems, and they sound exactly like Sylvia Plath, and they're just super angry. Don't go looking, but they're out there.
Google makes these things easier.
This is pre-Google, so they're not. Yeah, it'd be tough.
So I think this question boils down to how you doing, but people talk about writing as being a therapeutic experience sometimes and dealing with hard things and all of that. But I'm just curious if did that happen for you? Is that what this was at all?
That is a great question. Thank you. I appreciate it. No, it made things a lot worse. I was doing better before, and I think it's because I was sort of living in that sort of duality where I wasn't really experiencing it. But I guess the flip side of that is, would I have just gone on for the rest of my life and never dealt with it? And would that have been fine? Or would it have just burst out one day without me being aware? Sort of confronting the kidnapping and all this stuff was the thing that happened in the midst of writing the book, and I'm still in the midst of dealing with it. And so there are ways in which, I think I'm a very happy person generally. I think I'm an optimistic person generally. But there's still ways in which I find the memoir painful. I find it painful to think about, which is not to say that I'm not happy to talk about it. I am happy to talk about it, but it's difficult to think about this stuff because I've just managed to live most of my life not doing that. And then the other thing is, I'm in my late 40s, and this is going to sound sort of silly, but I feel weird dealing with this stuff that happened when I was a kid. You sort of have this feeling like I should be over it by now, right? But I never even started trying to get over it until like a year ago or something. And so it's really intense. I think I'm going to be fine because, as I said, I'm happy and optimistic, but it's a time. It's a real thing that's happening.
I can kind of tell that you didn't necessarily have that full critical distance, because there are moments in the book where like you write something and you're like, oh, I'm just writing this right now, and I'm like, what? Like
that happens,
and it's like, oh, this is a really active process for you. It's not like I lived this, I dealt with it, now I'm coming back to put it in a nice, neat shape. It's like it's still coming out in ways that are surprising me.
Yeah, the book documents the emergence of it, pretty much. Even though I'd written poems about it before and stuff.
Any other last questions before people come up and get the books that they bought signed? Others?
Thank you. I'm curious what school was like for you. If it was a respite, if it was a place away from your grandparents that brought you some peace, or it seems like something you sought out after going through, grade school and through high school?
That's a complicated question. I did a lot of school. I did 3 graduate degrees. But I didn't start liking school until college. When I was a kid, I was intensely competitive. I say that as if I'm not. I still am. That never went away. But that competitiveness helped to sort of drive success in school when I was young. And then when my grandparents moved from Texas to California, I felt, as I write about, that my entire world was ending. And I didn't realize it at the time. I realized it while writing the book, that the reason I felt that way was because there's a way in which that move recapitulated my kidnapping, but also the feeling was, it was because of my kidnapping that I felt so awful leaving my friends. And I could never understand why that was an injury that I could never get over when I was like 11, moving. But I couldn't. At that point, I essentially dropped out of life. I stopped caring about school. I stopped doing it. Eventually dropped out of school after years, but I had no interest at all in school, and I had no vision of any future for me at all until, I started to think maybe I could write poems because I liked doing that a lot, and I had thought for a while that I would be a professional skateboarder. But I didn't start liking school until I was 21 and I started doing community college. And then I went to community college, I went to a 4-year, and then I did 3 graduate degrees, and I liked it the whole time. I never thought of it as a respite, though. It was just a thing you had to do, and I wanted to do it well for a while, and then I had to do it and didn't care about it. And then I felt like, in college and stuff, that I needed to do it if I wanted to have a career in the field in which I was working. but I enjoyed it then.
Actually, I had one more question, quick.
Sure.
Do you feel like this is a particularly, make sure I get the right word, Oregonian story? Because I don't know if everyone sort of knows that history about Oregon in terms of, you know, it being the last sort of holdout in terms of the slave states and like the type of sentiments that exist out there.
Is this an Oregonian story? Well,
Not really is it, but like, does it feel like?
I mean, I guess in some ways, but mostly it was unfolding in the South, at least the childhood part. But yeah, when I finally moved back up north, actually when I moved back to Oregon, when I was like 14, I became more aware of racism than I had been in the South, and than I had been even in California. And so I think that it is an Oregonian story and a Texan story and a story of what would have been possible in the late 70s, early 80s with regard to race that I don't think is possible in the same way now. You know, like with regard to my father not being able to find me and not feeling like he had the right to look or that he could ask anybody for help. I don't think he would feel the same way now. But back then, he did. But yeah, Oregon attitude's a part of it. Sure. Eastern Oregon, even though that's not where we lived.
Thank you, Shane. Thank you all. We'll be signing books up at the front, so please bring those up. And everyone, have a good night.
Thank you.